Hey everyone, it's Blake, and today I'm going to be going over an introduction to critical or K Affs. If you haven't watched the negative K video, the intro to critiques, um, I strongly recommend that you do that prior to watching this video, because as you can imagine, the K Aff and the K neg have a lot in common, but the K Aff is the one that typically trips students up a little bit more. So it's helpful to lay the groundwork of understanding the negative critique before we dig into the affirmative critique. And I would say a similar piece of advice goes as far as reading these arguments, that you want to read the negative critique, which is a little bit simpler for a while, and get comfortable with critical arguments before you start your venture into critical affirmatives. But with that disclaimer out of the way, I am still going to start with a repeat of a concept that was present in the negative critiques video, because it's just that important, and that is the concept of fiat. So fiat basically it means let it be done. And in the context of debate, that principle, that concept of fiat, is that when the ballot is signed, the affirmative is implemented or actually happens, if the ballot is signed in favor of the affirmative, that is. So fiat is kind of the fantasy or the imagined reality that the round that is happening will actually determine a real world action. So fiat is the moment in which the ballot is signed in favor of the affirmative and the aff happens. The aff gets to fiat the effect described. So then we can think of the timeline as basically split into a pre-fiat before the implementation of the aff period and a post-fiat after the implementation of the aff period. And the pre-fiat period is like the round itself, and the post-fiat period is the world after the aff is implemented. So offense that is considered pre-fiat is offense that does not depend on the advocacy of the aff working, but rather on the discursive and meta value of the aff mattering, whereas the post-fiat offense is dependent on the advocacy of the aff actually affecting positive real-world change. So pre-fiat or in the round offense is based on like the knowledge and education and the goodness of the discourse of the aff, whereas the post-fiat offense is based on the aff being a good idea when it's actually implemented. So with that out of the way, let's talk about K Affs proper. So when you're talking about K Affs, there's a major fork in the road that we have to address first, and that is topicality of a K Aff. So K Affs can either be topical or non-topical. So a topical K Aff affirms the resolution and most often conceptualizes the resolution as a good starting point for broader reform, most often relating to a social issue or a social structure that needs to be addressed. Whereas a non-topical K Aff does not affirm the resolution, it is not topical, right? And most often it makes the argument that the resolution is problematic or flawed in some significant way that makes it so that you can't reasonably and ethically affirm. So a topical aff is saying that the resolution is true and a good idea because of its critical effects, whereas a non-topical aff is saying from a critical viewpoint it's impossible to ethically affirm, so you have to prove that it is desirable to not affirm and propose an advocacy that addresses the issue that keeps you from affirming. So when we talk a little bit later about the advocacies of an aff, of a K aff, the topical advocacy normally reads something along the lines of like the resolution, do the resolution in order to XYZ, whereas the non-topical K aff advocacy is something along the lines of being totally distinct from the resolution, and sometimes will actively include reject the resolution in favor of XYZ action. So then another important concept that's related to K Affs that needs to be addressed after that major fork in the road is the issue of performance. So a lot of times when people talk about K Affs, the first thing that comes to their mind if they've seen K Affs before is performance affs. So performance affs are affirmatives that include some type of performative offense that is basically an embodiment of the critical argument that is being made by the aff itself. A K Aff does not need to have a performance. That is a misunderstanding that I hear sometimes, that if an Aff does not have a performance in it, then it's not a K Aff. That is not the case. There are many, many K Affs out there that do not include a performative aspect. But performances, when they are used to garner pre-fiat in the round discursive offense. If you want to go the performance route, the biggest piece of advice I can give you is that you do not spread through a performance. You don't rush through it. You don't try to speed it up. You don't try to do anything like that, because it's easier to win the fact that the performance affected something discursively pre-fiat if the performance is impactful. Think about reading a poem, for example. If I get up and I read a poem at 500 words per minute, is it going to have as much emotional impact as if I get up and I read it at an actual conversational pace? The answer is no. So it's harder for me to argue that the reading of the poem generated some positive form of education if it didn't have an impact because I spoke out 500 words per minute to get through it faster so I could get to the cards. So do not spread through a performance. Let it live, let it breathe, let it play out. There are no real limits on what a performance consists of. You can get as creative as you want with K Affs, and that's why a lot of people enjoy them. Some examples of types of performance out there are reading a narrative or a poem, playing a song while you read the Aff, delivering the Aff without speaking through something like sign language or written cards or something like that, or speaking a different language other than English in the performance of the Aff. All of these are things that are like performative embodiments of the thesis of what the critique is arguing about. So performance is not necessary for a K Aff, but it's something that you can do to integrate into a K Aff to get some more pre-fiat offense. So now let's talk about the structure of a K Aff. Now that we've gotten the kind of like types of a K Aff discussion out of the way, we can dig into what the K Aff actually consists of. And just a disclaimer on the structure of a K Aff, the order of the parts of a K Aff change depending on what the K Aff is trying to express. I like to say that K Affs are stories. You're trying to tell a story, and so you need to structure the case in a way that best tells that story. Most often, it is the case that some kind of separation into parts makes it easier to use strategically in the round, because you can reference back to individual parts and cards more clearly. So you can separate it into like links, impact, and solvency sections, or you can separate it into something like chapters or acts or creative titles that tie into the narrative or thematic part of the story that you're telling. Or you could also use performance, like we just talked about, to break up the parts by having like a poem split up to separate the parts, so you're clearly transitioning to the next part of the case because you slowed down and started doing this performative aspect of it. So tell a story and structure it in the best way to tell that story. But the parts of a K Aff that need to be in there somewhere are links, impacts, a role of the ballot, advocacy, and solvency. So let's talk about each of those. So the links are how the resolution ties to the subject matter of the Aff. So if it's a topical Aff, how the problems that the Aff solves impact a certain group. So if the Aff is about racism and the topic is about nuclear power, the link might be something about how nuclear power and the waste from nuclear power plants and the zoning of nuclear power plants disproportionately affects people of color. So that is a thing that is related to the school of critical literature, but is a material thing that the topic itself will actually address. So it is somewhere between like a link on a contention of a traditional Aff and the link on a critique. Whereas a non-topical Aff, the link is how the resolution is violent, what the Aff does that is bad, the resolution does that is bad. So you can think of it like the negative critique link. It is basically the resolution is bad for X reason. You should read as many links as you can, because this is a part where there's a lot of argumentation occurring, especially for a non-topical Aff, because if you get up and you're like, here's one reason why I can't affirm, and then you move on, it's going to be pretty persuasive for the negative to be able to say that that is unfair and that you did not prove beyond a reasonable doubt that you can't affirm ethically. So if you're going the non-topical route, you need to make sure that your links are really solid. You also want to be as specific as possible. You don't want to just get up and say, I can't affirm the resolution because the resolution uses the United States and the United States is bad. That's so generic that it's not really going to be persuasive to most judges. Next to the impacts, this is just like in any other format of arguments. The impacts are the bad things that the AF claims to solve, prevent, or minimize. Most often in a K Aff, there will be some kind of root cause claim, just like there are in negative critiques. So the root cause claim is saying that the impact being described by the affirmative is the impact that underpins all other forms of violence that we are trying to solve. So in material terms, like an example of one of these arguments would be like ableism. Ableism is the root cause of other form of violence because we oppress people based on our perception that they are able to do different things, or have differing cognitive capabilities than ours. So that is the claim that ableism is the impact that leads to all of the other impacts that we're going to be discussing in the round. So therefore, it's really important that we address ableism first, which is why effective impacts can then set up the role of the ballot, which says explicitly that we need to focus on that form of violence described in the impact. So to talk about the role of the ballot proper, the verbiage of the role of the ballot is most often the role of the ballot is to vote for the debater who best XYZ. It is specific to the school of K literature. So you don't generally want to read a role of the ballot on the K Aff that's just like maximizing expected well-being or minimizing structural violence, because that's so generic and broad that you're allowing the negative to gain access to it very easily. Whereas if it's something specific to sexism, racism, ableism, securitization, militarism, capitalism, if it's something specific to that, then the AF links very clearly, and the neg is going to have a hard time linking to your framework. It should argue why this kind of impact comes first, so that's where the stuff like the root cause claims come into play. And remember, roles of the ballot, back to our framework video, role of the ballot is a meta argument. So the justification should be related to debate, education, or discourse. So you can explain why it's so important in educational spaces specifically to address the form of violence that you're discussing. Next is the advocacy. Occasionally, I hear people read K Affs and say that the alternative is to do so and so. This is kind of like not a huge deal, but it's just a pet peeve of a lot of judges. The AF can't read an alternative because it's not an alternative to something. The AF has the job of proposing the action, so it's an advocacy, not an alternative. If you're topical, this is kind of what we talked about at the very beginning of the video. If it's topical, you are going to say that you affirm the resolution as a means to do XYZ, whereas if it's not topical, you're going to say reject the resolution in favor of XYZ. And I have here workshop, workshop, workshop. Your advocacy will never be perfect. You'll never be 100% happy with it, but you should continually be evolving it and refining it and getting it more precise with the language that you're using. It's not just minimize bad things, so it's not just like reject the resolution in favor of ending racism. It is a specific method through which we can do that thing. And the other thing that I will note here is that the advocacy should be somewhat simple to understand. It should be describing the action in as simple terms as possible. So if the critical literature that you're drawing from has a lot of jargon in terms of art in it, the advocacy can include those terms, but it should also include an explanation of those terms, because if the judge doesn't understand the advocacy, doesn't understand what they're implementing, then they're going to have a hard time voting for it. So the advocacy should be something that is easy for the judge to understand. The last part that I'll talk about is solvency. So this is multiple carded reasons why the advocacy achieves the role of the ballot, why the implementation of what the AF is defending will lead to good things, specific links to the critical method described in the advocacy. So it's not just, reasons why getting rid of this structural problem is a good thing. It's reasons why the method described by the advocacy is effective at getting rid of those bad things. And if it's topical, you generally want to include topical solvency cards that aren't just about the critical method that the resolution is an example of, but of the resolution and the specifics of it itself. Um, so solvency is a really important part of the KF, obviously, because it proves the desirability of the advocacy. So some final thoughts on K Affs. There aren't really any rules to K Affs. Like I just said, there's all these parts, but those parts in the format are constantly changing because you're trying to tell a story and format the case as a means to best tell that story. Um, Another thing that some K Affs will include and some won't will be like a underview or a method section or something like that that is a preempt to tier theory or to negative critiques and stuff like that. So you might see occasionally a method section or an underview that preempts things like tier theory. It's really important before you get into K Affs that you have your foundational traditional debate skills down, because K Affs are an uphill battle inherently. So you need to make sure that you have all of the tools at your disposal, as many as possible, of those foundational skills down, so that you can more effectively defend the KF. Another note I have on here is do lots and lots of reading. You shouldn't just take an old card from an old file that defines a method and plug it in, and that's the only familiarity you have with that method. You should like read the article that these cards come from, read books that the authors have written, read as much as you can, because the more you read, the more you'll understand the method, the easier time you'll have defending it. Another thing, more specific Ks are typically more strategic, so try to minimize card recycling. You can use the same method topic after topic, but you should be using unique links and solvency arguments that are contextual to the topic, because if you're just reading an aff that is exactly identical every topic, you're going to have a harder time defending why it is non-topical, or why it proves the resolution true if you're trying to be topical. So be specific with your links and stuff like that when possible. If you're going to recycle any kind of cards, it's the impact and method stuff, but the link stuff should be new to each topic. And lastly, K Affs are a balancing act between strategy and advocacy. Most people choose to read K Affs because they're really passionate and believe in the argument that they're going for. But debate at the same time is a game, and it's important to try to win that game if that is ultimately what your goal is. So a K Aff is both a piece of advocacy and a strategic entity. So when you are designing your K Aff, if it's something that you're passionate about, make sure that your advocacy is staying true and that you're not changing or weakening your point of advocacy because you're trying to cram in as many preempts as possible. Now, that being said, if you just care about winning off of the K Aff and you don't have much of a personal advocacy connected to it, then you're going to lean more heavily into the strategy camp. But generally speaking, K Affs are a balancing act, and I just wanted to acknowledge that and give that piece of advice to any people that are starting a long journey with K Affs that include personal ties or personal advocacy things that are important to them. It's a balancing act. Be aware of that, and best of luck. That's all I have for this video. As always, if you have any questions, leave a comment, let me know, anything like that. And I hope you have a good rest of your day.